China goes communist. Russia, as early as 1920, was conspiring against China. Shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution ended in 1918, the communists announced, "We are marching to free the people of China." In 1921, a Russian agent was sent to Peking, then to Shanghai, to make plans for the first Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, which would become the world's largest. They began to infiltrate the government in 1922, and by 1924, the Chinese armed forces were reorganized along the same lines as the Soviet Army. Chiang Kai-shek, 1887 to 1975, was the Commandant, and Chou En-lai was in charge of political affairs. With the use of Soviet troops commanded by General Michael Borodin, Chiang attacked Shanghai, robbing the Rothschild-affiliated Soong bank. President Coolidge refused to send U.S. troops against the Chinese forces, and TV. Soong negotiated with Chiang, offering him $3 million, his sister May-ling as a wife, even though Chiang had a wife and family, and the presidency of China for life, if he would change sides. He agreed, and began to rule China as a British ally. In December 1927, he married the sister of Soong. Seeing the Russians as a threat to his country, he had them ejected, and had many communist advisors arrested. Mao Zedong fled, and hid out in the northern provinces, where he began training rebels for a future insurrection. In 1937, Japan attacked Shanghai, and coupled with the growing communist insurgency, created a two-front war. China needed help, and sent the following telegram to Roosevelt on December 8, 1941. "To our new common battle, we offer all we are and all we have to stand with you until the Pacific and the world are freed from the curse of brute force and endless perfidy." China's plea was brushed off, and they were the last country to get military aid, which came in the form of a $250 million loan and gold to stabilize their economy. Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Harry Dexter White, the Soviet spy, was in charge of making sure China got the money, and over a period of 3 years, he only sent them $27 million. In 1945, Congress voted a second loan of $500 million, and Dexter made sure they didn't get any of that, which resulted in the collapse of their economy. After World War II, Special Envoys General George C. Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, and CFR member, who served as Secretary of State 1947-49, and Secretary of Defense 1950-51, who had knowledge of the impending attack on Pearl Harbor, but didn't inform the commanders in the Pacific, and Patrick J. Hurley were sent to China to meet with Chiang Kai-shek. They urged him to give the communists representation in the Chinese government, and for the nationalists, Kuomintang, to have a coalition government, since they felt that the Russians weren't influencing the Chinese communists. However, Chiang would not accept any kind of communist influence in his government, so Marshall recommended that all American aid be stopped, and an embargo enforced. There was no fuel for Chinese tanks and planes, or ammunition for weapons. Russia gave the Chinese communist military supplies they had captured from Japan, and also diverted some of the American Lend-Lease material to them. Soon, Mao began making his final preparations to take over the government. High-level State Department officials, such as Harry Dexter White and Owen Lattimore, who were members of the Institute of Pacific Relations, besides planning the destruction of the Chinese economy, also falsified documents to indicate that the Chinese communists were actually farmers who were pushing for agricultural reform. Thus, from 1943-49, magazines like the Saturday Evening Post, who ran over 60 articles, and Collier's, advocated and promoted the communist movement. While Mao Zedong was made to appear as an agrarian reformer, Chiang was blasted for being a corrupt dictator. In 1945, Lattimore sent President Truman a memorandum suggesting a coalition government between the communists and the national government. John Carter Vinson of the IPR elaborated upon that memo, and it became the basis upon which Truman based his China policy, which was announced on December 15, 1945. It was alleged by some researchers that Russia sent China a telegram, saying that if they didn't surrender, they would be destroyed. They were requested to send 10 technicians to see the bomb that would be used, and when they went, they saw an atomic bomb with the capability of destroying a large city. As the story goes, Chiang sent a telegram to President Truman, asking for help. Truman refused. In 1948, Congress voted to send China $125 million in military aid, but again the money was held up until Chiang was defeated. In October 1949, 450 million people were turned over to the communist movement. Chiang fled to the island of Taiwan, 110 miles off the east coast of China, where he governed that country under a democracy. Mao Zedong, who announced in 1921 that he was a Marxist, after reading the Communist Manifesto, took over as China's leader, and Peking was established as the new capital. On February 14, 1950, a 30-year treaty of friendship was signed with Russia. In March 1953, Mao proposed to the Soviet Union a plan for world conquest, in which every country, except the United States, would be communist-controlled by 1973. It was called a Memorandum on a New Program for World Revolution, and was taken to Moscow by the Chinese Foreign Minister, Chou En-lai. The first phase was to be completed by 1960, and called for Korea, Formosa, and Indochina to be under Chinese control. On July 15, 1971, Chairman Mao appealed to the world to unite and defeat the U.S. aggressors and all their running dogs. While campaigning in 1968, Richard Nixon said, "I would not recognize Red China now, and I would not agree to admitting it to the United Nations." In his book Six Crises, he said that admitting Red China to the United Nations would be a mockery of the provision of the Charter which limits its membership to peace-loving nations. And what was most disturbing was that it would give respectability to the communist regime, which would immediately increase its power and prestige in Asia, and probably irreparably weaken the non-communist governments in that area. Yet it was Nixon who opened the dialogue with China, and in 1971, Communist China was seated as a member country of the United Nations, while the Republic of China, Taiwan, was thrown out. With the visits to China by Nixon and Kissinger in 1971, on up to Reagan in 1984, relations between the two countries were almost as good as they were when they were allies in 1937. In 1978, President Carter approved the sending of U.S. technology to China, and the American government recognized the Communists as the official government of China. On January 1, 1979, Carter severed diplomatic ties with Taiwan, saying that there is but one China, and Taiwan is part of China.